We have unpaid liabilities that reach into the hundreds of trillions. So you got $36.5 trillion of public debt, but then on top of it, you've got all these unpaid liabilities of Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. The U.S. fiscal starts on October 1, so our first quarter just ended. We ran a $711 billion deficit. Well, do the math on that, right? That's a $2.8 trillion annual deficit.
The US is drowning in $36.5 trillion of public debt, with unfunded liabilities reaching into the hundreds of trillions. Can America ever escape this financial black hole? James Lavish, a seasoned institutional investor and Bitcoin advocate, explains how the Bitcoin Reserve Act could be the key to stabilizing the economy. From unsustainable deficits to the strategic accumulation of Bitcoin, Lavish lays out the financial game theory behind the global shift away from US Treasuries and toward hard assets like Bitcoin. Will the US government make a bold move to secure its financial future? Or will bureaucratic inertia push the system closer to collapse? If you want to stay ahead of the biggest financial shifts and Bitcoin's growing role in the global economy, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss an update.
Yeah, no, I think that they can coexist, and that Cynthia Lummis understands this. The issue here is that we have so much debt. How are we ever going to get out of this hole, this problem? And most people don't even talk about it. We have unpaid liabilities that reach into the hundreds of trillions. So you got $36.5 trillion of public debt, but then on top of it, you've got all these unpaid liabilities of Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. Now, let's take a step back. You've got the Doge Commission that's out there that's cutting expenses, and people say, some of the listeners might be saying, but what if we get into we get out of deficit and we actually are making money at the sovereign level, at the U.S. government is actually making money, and so. The issue is that our deficit is so big, right, that it's over $2 trillion. If you look at the first quarter of 2025, remember the U.S. fiscal starts on October 1, so our first quarter just ended. We ran a $711 billion deficit. Well, do the math on that, right? That's a $2.8 trillion annual deficit. It was 39% higher than the first quarter deficit of 2024. So anybody wants to say like, well, yeah, but you've got your tax payments that come in April. So it's not really but if you look apples to apples for the prior year, which we ran a $2.1 trillion deficit, we're up over 35%, near 40% higher. Then you've got the Doge Commission that comes in, and they've saved, if you look at the debt clock, I guess it's saying that we've saved somewhere about $100 billion so far. And so, okay, that's great. How much can we really save? Number one. And then number two, how much fraud is there on this unpaid liability side that we're starting to see, that we're paying Social Security to people who are 200 years old or something insane. I don't know if that's just clerical error or what's going on there. Where are those payments going? Well, we got to figure that out. Obviously, that is an issue. So maybe that $200 trillion number is $215 trillion number is lower, but it's still, they're not going to get it down to zero. So structurally, we have a problem, and that problem is that if you look at the debt, just really quickly, just big round numbers, we have mandatory expenses that are over $4 trillion. You've got defense that's $900 billion, almost a trillion dollars. You get net interest, the interest on our debt, which is $1 trillion, and which brings our total mandatory spending. This is stuff that's either in legislation or, you're not going to not pay, which is defense and interest on your own debt. You're not going to default on your debt. And then you've got discretionary spending of over $1 trillion. So even if Doge cut all that discretionary spending down to zero, they somehow got Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid down because of, massive just leakage there and irresponsibility on the way they spend the money. And it's not specifically the the dollars that are going to the recipients, but it's the administration. Even if they got that down, you'd have to get $1 trillion out of that, because you can't pull down an interest expense. It's highly unlikely that we're going to cut our defense down in half. But even if you did that, you still have to get $500 billion out of your mandatory expenses. So where is it really going to come from? That's the question. So for us to get into surplus, that's super unlikely. I mean, I'd love it. I'd love to see it, but I don't think it's going to happen. So that's just the setup, right? So we're likely not getting into surplus. So we still have this $36.5 trillion of debt we've got to deal with. And how are you going to deal with that? Well, this is where the Bitcoin Reserve Act comes in. So Senator Lummis from Wyoming, her idea is, look, why don't we buy 1 million Bitcoin over 5 years? And over time, if you look at the performance of Bitcoin and how it is retaining its value against the debasement of all other currencies, then that reserve will enable us to pay down a very large portion of the debt in the future, or back Treasuries with it, which will stabilize the Treasury, and that ends up stabilizing the U.S. dollar, right? Because the biggest issue that we have right now, which has been growing over the last number of years, is that we're seeing sovereigns reluctant to own treasuries, to hold treasuries. Now, everybody around the world needs dollars, right? We're on the U.S. dollar is it's the reserve currency of the world. The U.S. Treasury is the reserve asset of the world. But we made some, key mistakes in this last administration, like cutting off Russia from SWIFT and seizing their assets, including treasuries. This just signaled the world that, well, you don't want to be holding treasuries unless you're a very, very good ally of the U.S., because they could just seize them from you. So we got to find something else to buy. So they've been buying gold. That you've seen that. A lot of them have been buying gold, and they've been buying Bitcoin. And so they know that it will hold its value over a long period of time against the dollar. So the previous thinking was, if you hold treasuries, you'll make an interest rate that'll give you at least a neutral return, if not a positive real return on that debasement, meaning the inflation is going up. You need to make more interest on your bonds to keep up with that inflation. But do we want to hold those now if they can be seized from us? That's an issue for all the BRICS countries. And so that's why you're hearing them talk about, they're not trying to, create a new currency for them. They just want to be able to get away from the treasury. That's the issue. They know that they're still going to need dollars. So that's the whole point. The Bitcoin and the strategic reserve then starts this game theory where all of these sovereigns have to, they have to consider, what if the U.S. owns 5% of the Bitcoin, total Bitcoin float, and we own none? That's a problem. So now you're seeing countries step in and start putting Bitcoin on their balance sheets because of this, because they know that this could be a big problem if we don't, if we don't own Bitcoin ourselves. There are two paths, like you just said. Cynthia Lummis, she has the Bitcoin Act, and that would be the Bitcoin Strategic Reserve that we talked about, the million Bitcoin over 5 years, 200,000 Bitcoin a year. And that would be the first. That's one that we've heard of. Also, we've heard, since Trump was elected, people rumbling or talking about possibly an executive order. So what would that look like? Well, through the Gold Reserve Act of 1934, it's possible that he could use the Exchange Stabilization Fund in order to buy Bitcoin. Now, there's some differences here, though. So he did it through executive order. that executive order could be overturned by the next administration pretty quickly, I would think. So that's one thing. So it's not really as powerful, but it's quicker. You could do it overnight and start accumulating Bitcoin immediately, And so what does that look like? Well, there's $200 billion in that fund. But that's not all available for Bitcoin. There might be 40, 50 or 60 billion available, maybe as much as half of it. But you're talking about, it's still a lot of Bitcoin, $40 billion. And let's say that they pass it and Bitcoin runs. I mean, it's not going to be at 120,000, that would mean that we're probably only buying 250,000 Bitcoin instead of 1 million. But we would be buying it quickly. Maybe half a million Bitcoin, but likely not. If he announced that order, that Bitcoin's going to, it's going to run pretty quickly because of what you just said. Everybody and their, sister and brother are going to be out there buying it, not just other nations. And so, you'll see a supply shock. The big thing is not so many people out there buying. It would be a lot. It would be the other half of it is people be reluctant to sell. Like I'm not, if the government's gonna be out there buying, I'm not going to sell mine. So there would just be this liquidity issue. It would be a squeeze. And so that's one path. I think it's pretty low likelihood because you'd have to, there's some reasons for that. If he did that, he would be signaling to the world that he's worried about the US dollar, exchange stabilization. Like we have to stabilize our currency, that's a bad signal to the world. And that might send the wrong signal on the US dollar. So that would be worrisome. And I think he's probably reluctant to do that, even if it is something he could do. Because, he doesn't want to be, Trump really cares about his legacy, about how he's seen. He wants the market to be at all-time highs. I know his family owns some Bitcoin. He wouldn't mind that. I'm sure he wants his Trump coin to be at all-time highs. He's got a huge ego, and he wants his, like, he talks about the market all the time. If he initiated the exchange stabilization fund to buy Bitcoin through an executive order, I mean, that might tip off a sell-off in the markets, in the general markets, because, oh my God, I don't want to own US dollars. Even the government knows there's a problem because of all this debt. Because all these years we've been talking about debt. We've been talking about debt for decades and how it's a problem. It's never been a problem. So when you hear traditional market analysts talk about it, they're like, we'll deal with it like we always have, no big problem. It's just debt. Debt, it creates productivity, and which part of that is right? Okay. It is true that debt creates productivity. It brings future productivity into the now, but irresponsible use of debt doesn't. And so that would tip people off to that problem. And then that means he and his cabinet would probably be reluctant to do that. I mean, what would be the point? Just to get Bitcoin to go up? I don't see that. So the second thing is congressional approval, which would be the Bitcoin Act. The issue or the challenge here is that, Senator Lummis doesn't even have a co-sponsor for the bill yet. I mean, you got to get a co-sponsor for the bill, number one. Then you've got to start putting it through committees. So it has to run this gauntlet of approval. So you got to put it through committees. Then you've got comment periods. Then you'll have negotiations on the terms. Then you'll have revisions of the terms. And even if it was passed, if it gets through all that, that gauntlet, and both houses of Congress pass it, or both branches of Congress, the Senate and Congress pass it, House of Representatives, then even if that happens, it likely doesn't look like it does today. So who knows what it would really look like. If it did get to Trump's desk, it's likely to be signed. But I think it's just going to take a while. And, do I think it's likely? I mean, at this point, I would give it even odds, but I would give it lower odds of this year happening. So these things just take so much time, and there's so many other things going on right now. The government's in a battle of survival against Doge. because there's so much waste that they're uncovering. They're focused on that right now. That's really their big focus. Let's cut this waste first, then we'll figure out the other stuff later, I would think. But that's kind of my thought on it. Do I think it happens eventually? Well, game theory says it would. Do I think that we have ways of accumulating Bitcoin that surreptitiously without the other nations knowing it? Well, it's possible. I mean, we've seen a lot of spending that we have no idea where that money is and where it goes. Sure, it's possible we could use, some sort of NGO to do it. Would that be a black mark on this administration because they did exactly what they're, cracking down on? Likely. So again, that's unlikely to happen. They would do it in the right channels, in my opinion. But it's I've lived long enough to know to not expect anything.